All right. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the forum today. I'm the Rev Sara Lewis. I'm Director of Community and Faith Development for Olympia Unitarian Universalist Congregation. And thank you for coming for this forum with special guests about the process of Unitarian Universalist ministerial formation. I'm going to introduce our guests who are in the room, and I invite you to wave when your bio is read. We have today with us Elisabeth Geschiere. Elisabeth is a descendant of Dutch Protestant Christian working class immigrants who were mostly farmers. She is an aspirant UU minister and chaplain whose sponsoring congregation is the First UU Church of Nashville. Elisabeth's passions include dismantling white supremacy as spiritual work, embodied living, queer theology and spiritual care, trauma-informed healing, and connectedness with the earth. Thank you for being here today, Elisabeth. We also have our own beloved Rev Carol McKinley. Rev Carol McKinley, OUUC's affiliated community minister, has served as coordinator for Washington UU Voices for Justice, our statewide legislative advocacy organization, and as OUUC's Faith in Action ministry lead. She has been a UU for more than 50 years and came to ministry following careers in teaching and book selling. We also have Rylee Uhrich. Rylee is a social work and ministry student who lives here in Olympia and is a member of OUUC. She currently works at Community Youth Services as an intern therapist while attending Louisiana State University for her social work degree. She has completed part of a Master's of Divinity at Starr and is a candidate for UU ordination. Rylee's career focus is on chaplaincy, but she is currently enjoying her work in youth services and remains curious about where her call to ministry will lead her next. And then we have Rev Mary Gear. Rev Mary is in her 4th year as our settled minister for OUUC. She's also known as the called, senior, or lead minister, just to make it more confusing. She came to ministry by way of social work, receiving her MSW from Walla Walla University and Master of Divinity from Starr School for the Ministry. She has served 3 congregations as a minister: McMinnville, First Unitarian Portland, and Olympia, and has been a UU for more than 30 years. So thank you all for being here today to be our panel. This forum was Rylee's idea. So shout out to Rylee, who recognized that we currently have a few student ministers and thought it would be good for the congregation to understand what that means. OUUC is a learning community for all of us, but there are specific ways that we can support the learning of those who are in ministerial formation. And then I just wanted to make a quick note about my own ministerial formation. The process that we're going to focus on today is UU ministerial formation process. And just to add more layers of confusion for you all, that doesn't apply to me. I am not a UU minister. For many reasons, some that were part of my calling and some that were pragmatic, I attended the Chaplaincy Institute, which is an interfaith seminary. And so I am an interfaith minister, which is a different flavor than a Unitarian Universalist minister. My formation process was different. And also importantly, my relationships of accountability now for maintaining ethical standards and continuing education expectations are also different. My relationships are with the Chaplaincy Institute and that community of interfaith ministers. So that said, I'm going to pass this over to Reverend Mary, who is going to give us a hopefully brief and clear overview of what the process looks like for Unitarian Universalist ministerial formation. Thank you, Rev Mary.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And thank you, Elisabeth, Rylee, and Carol for being here. You'll see that there's a fifth chair here, and I just want to mention that we have one other minister in formation in this congregation, and that's Emi Allen, who is not here this morning. Emi started seminary this last January, and so is at the very beginning of that process. And so just want to hold up Emi. So this is a lot of ministers in a congregation, and how wonderful is that?
And if you can still hear
just
me
a
in
word
the
about the
room.
word formation. Sarah's used that word several times, that we're ministers in formation. And that's kind of the term of art, if you will. And really it calls out the fact that ministry is a process. Becoming a minister is a process. And I think that process continues for our whole lives. And so the image that I came up with when I was in seminary was, the image of forming clay is an ancient and biblical image. And oftentimes, at least in my process, in my formation, it felt like, how the potter takes the clay and slaps it down on the stone and then pounds on it a little bit? That's kind of what ministerial formation can feel like sometimes. Yeah. It is a process of transformation, which is the intent, right? And transformation is challenging and wonderful and all those things. So the other thing I want to just mention is to follow up on what Reverend Sarah just said. The process we're going to talk about is the process for Unitarian Universalist ministers. Different denominations have very different processes of formation and of ordination and all of those, and connection with congregations and chaplaincy and all those kinds of things. So there's 4 different levels of ministerial formation in the UU process. The first is someone applies, they're an applicant, and says, I think I'm interested in this, what do I need to do? And then that applicant becomes an aspirant. And what that requires is an interview with a UU minister. So there needs to be some connection with a minister and a congregation. They enter seminary. They have a background check. We get background checked a lot. And there's a congregational sponsorship. So Elisabeth mentioned that her sponsoring congregation is in Nashville. OUUC is the sponsoring congregation for Rylee, right? So what that really says is that an aspirant is in relationship with the UU congregation and is connected with our denomination. There's also now some support around aspirants and candidates, which is the next level, which is the Ministerial Formation Network. And that was not in place when I was coming up. So I'm hoping Rylee and Elisabeth, you'll talk about that a little bit and what that looks like. And now folks in formation are assigned a career advisor and have some support through that process, which is a wonderful addition, I think. So then next comes a candidate for ministry. And at that point, someone is having a career assessment, which is some career testing, vocational testing kind of thing, and some psychological testing. We take the MMPI just to make sure that we're, stable and all those kinds of things, and have a conversation with a minister who's often a psychologist. A candidate has completed at least 1 year of seminary, has completed a unit of clinical pastoral education. That's CPE for short. And that's a chaplaincy internship often in a hospital or a hospice or something like that. And Elisabeth will have more to say about that, I bet. The requirement for UU ministers in formation is to do 1 unit of CPE, which is typically 3 to 4 months. I did my 1 unit of CPE at the Oregon State Hospital in Salem, and there's lots of different places where folks do that. And then an internship of some kind. Oh, Emi is online. Wonderful. So we'll make sure that we make some room for Emi to say hello and check in. So the other thing that a candidate does is an internship. And used to be that the internship had to be in a congregational setting. Now internships are allowed to be in a chaplaincy setting, which recognizes that not everybody wants to be a parish minister. So some internships are year-long chaplaincy residencies. Some interns in parishes are 1 year full-time or 2 years part-time. And then when the candidate gets to a point of, fulfilling the major requirements, then they go before the Ministerial Fellowship Committee, the dreaded MFC among ministers, and it's a little bit like defending your dissertation. It's really, answering questions about our call, and there's some factual information as well, like do we know about Unitarian Universalism and those kinds of things. And the interview with the Ministerial Fellowship Committee, which is a committee of the Unitarian Universalist Association, they decide whether they invite us into fellowship with the UUA. They're the body that says, yes, we recognize you as a Unitarian Universalist minister. So in order to be a UU minister, you have to have a Master's of Divinity from an accredited seminary. You have to have a career assessment from an approved organization. You have to have completed at least 1 unit of CPE, clinical pastoral education. You have to have completed an internship, and you have to be blessed by the Ministerial Fellowship Committee. Yeah, it's a process for sure. Then, once you're invited into fellowship with the UUA as a minister, you're in preliminary fellowship for 3 years. Yes, and you get evaluated every year. So when I arrived here in Olympia, I had completed 2 years of my 3 years in preliminary fellowship. I did those in Portland. And so my first year here, I was in preliminary fellowship. And what that meant is the transition committee, you were on that, Alice, wrote an evaluation for me. I evaluated myself, and the board wrote an evaluation of me that first year. And after someone's been in preliminary fellowship for 3 years, assuming the evaluations are good, they're invited into full fellowship. And that's where Reverend Carol and I are now. And our requirement for continued ministry is continuing education credits. And those are, we're required to do some continuing education in the areas of anti-racism, anti-oppression, multicultural work, and ethics and boundaries. So that's the process of becoming a UU minister. Yeah, ethics and boundaries. Yeah. So all of that is to be a minister in fellowship with the Unitarian Universalist Association. The only in our denomination, the only way that a minister can assume the title of reverend is if they're ordained by a congregation. So the UUA doesn't make someone a reverend, a congregation makes someone a reverend. And so typically what happens is the UUA invites someone a minister into preliminary fellowship, and then they're ordained by a congregation. And then installation, we had one of those last June. That's the separate process of covenanting between a minister and a congregation. So the last thing that I'll say is that there's lots of different kinds of ministers. There's ministers who serve in parishes or congregations like I do. There's community ministers like Reverend Carol and Rylee and Elisabeth and Emi, who serve in community settings, sometimes in hospitals or hospices or other medical settings. There are ministers who do entrepreneurial ministry, is what it's called. There are ministers, UU ministers, who have run for office, who are in the political system, who are journalists, who are writers, who are academics and teach in seminaries or other settings. And so lots of different ways to practice ministry in the world. So I think I'll take questions about this process, and let me bring you the mic and you can speak into it so everyone can hear.
I'm more interested in hearing about entrepreneurial ministry. How does that work?
Yeah, so do either of you want to speak to that? Because I think you might know more than I do. Yeah, thanks.
I have some colleagues from seminary who were on an entrepreneurial ministry track, and it's enough integrated into ministerial formation now that there are entrepreneurial ministry classes in seminary. And it's people who have identified their desire to serve congregations, but it's kind of like an independent contractor often. It can look like a lot of ways. This is one model where people are creating programming or assessing a need that they see in Unitarian Universalist community and providing services, but to multiple congregations. So some people are supporting with music in multiple congregations. Some people are supporting with what is food ministry, and creating programming that it might be like a package that they sell to congregations, or they might be subcontracted and hired. But it can look like a lot of things, kind of like with anything entrepreneurial. It doesn't always take that shape, but that's kind of a recognizable shape of thinking about how it might interact with congregations. And some entrepreneurs are serving UU community directly, and some entrepreneurs are founded in their Unitarian Universalist principles and working in the world and less focused in UU congregations. Do you want to add?
I'm going to try to keep my mask on. I think that's working, right? Great. Well, another example I think of is somebody who's a spiritual director. And so that's like a private practice, but they might be an ordained UU minister. So an example is Reverend Tandy Rogers, who's based in Tacoma. And she worked for the UUA for a long time, but now she solely does spiritual direction in private practice. So, I mean, she certainly might not use that term, but I think that would still fit under that umbrella. Did you have a clarifying question on that, or a different question?
Could someone be a community minister who is a motivational speaker, a circuit speaker?
Yeah, I would say yes, for sure. Yeah.
I'm wondering where the Masters of Divinity fits in. Does everybody I see here have gone through seminary to get a Master's of Divinity, or is it at colleges before they start into the chaplaincy? Like, has Sarah done a Master's of Divinity, or?
So Sarah mentioned.
Sounds like they want you to unmute.
Sarah mentioned that Sarah, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so mine is a bit different. And one of the interesting things about the Chaplaincy Institute is that it's currently still not accredited. So my completion of seminary through the Chaplaincy Institute is not a Master's of Divinity. Whereas in the UU formation process for ministers, the expectation is to have a Master's of Divinity, which would need to be an accredited educational institution. And while I have the unmuting, I just would like to say that since I didn't introduce Emi earlier, I'd like to read Emi's bio and welcome Emi, who is here online with us. So Emi Frances Allen, wave online, is a queer, non-binary, poor Crip and grew up mostly in Olympia. They came to OUUC with their mother as a youth, received the Social Justice Award, and attended Golmine Religious Leadership School. They are a Buddhist Jewish witch and work particularly for racial justice and with Pizza Klatch, a support group in local high schools for LGBTQIA+ youth. They're in their second semester at Starr King School of Ministry, pursuing social justice and community ministry. They are still finding their way through their focus and love religious studies. They are also a Pisces and obsessed with Lord of the Rings and Melissa McCarthy. Their mom is their soulmate, and they love their friends and community and their family, chosen and birth. Thank you for being here with us, Emi. So I'd like to move us on to some planned questions for the panel. And then we'll open up for some more questions from both those who are online and in the sanctuary. So for this first question, it's one that you'll all probably have been answering a lot. Tell us about your call to ministry. And Emi, if whenever you want to answer a question, just wave and we'll make sure that you get that opportunity also. But anyone who would like to answer this question first, tell us about your call to ministry.
So I actually entered seminary when I was 60 years old. So I had had a variety of careers prior to that. I was working for our state legislature here in Washington, and was also very concerned about a number of justice issues that continue to this day. And I began thinking, and I, of course, have been a UU since the 1960s, but I began thinking, you know, that rather than changing laws, which is what our legislature does and our lobbyists do, I was thinking, we really need to change hearts. And I thought, what is the best way? I mean, this is a process going on in my own head. How do we do that? And to me, that's always been through religious tradition, that because that's what the focus of a religion is. How do we develop heart for other people? How do we actually then use that heart that's developed to bring about greater justice, greater love in the world? So that was my decision. I talked to several people. The Reverend Shirley Rank was our interim here at OUUC at the time. I talked to her. I talked to the Reverend Peter Rabel, who was in Seattle, retired from University Church, and then went to Seattle University School of Theology and Ministry, which is a wonderful Jesuit institution, which I valued very much, the education I had there. And Mary outlined the formation process, the process in seminary. I had an identical process to a parish minister, although I am a community minister. So my focus has always been not to serve a congregation, but to serve the larger community, specifically working with interfaith groups, because I believe that's where our strength comes. Unitarian Universalism is a small denomination, if not the smallest of the Protestant denominations in the country. And I believe our strength comes in collaboration, supporting, having the back of people in other interfaith communities, and having them have our backs when we are doing our justice work or work in the larger community. So that process that Mary described in terms of the aspirant, the candidate, and so on, we did here. I did my chaplaincy again because I'm a community minister. I sought to do my internship in a community setting. So I did that at a women's prison here for the Washington State Corrections Department. And then I also did an internship with Interfaith Works here in Olympia, working with interfaith communities. And then my focus, as I say, has been in justice work, and specifically through some of our legislative advocacy work. That's been a big interest to me. And because I work for the legislature, it was a little easier for me to step into that role too. Right.
I have a meandering call to ministry, especially in the context here where we're talking specifically about UU ministry. I'll just highlight that I had a lot of deep spiritual growth in pagan community and had already experienced a call to spiritual leadership in those spaces that is distinct. Spiritual leadership is, for me, distinct from religious leadership because there are ultimately more hoops and structures in religious leadership. And it is it's a process that is actually backed by the US government as compared to spiritual leadership, which you could ask me about later. And I had, in my own exploration of what my spiritual leadership could look like as a profession, I had already done a unit of CPE at St. Pete's here in Olympia. I had not started a Master's of Divinity yet, so I was fairly anomalous. And I think that the only reason I got to do that was because there were less applicants that year. But it was a part of my spiritual development, and I was still curious where I was going. And then I had a distinct moment when I was on a road trip, theoretically on vacation, but listening to the audiobook of the new Jim Crow, which was a really important and impactful book when it came out and is still important. And the author, Michelle Alexander, had a background in law, but she had recently paused in her law practice in order to teach at Union Theological Seminary, and that, which is a renowned radical seminary in New York City. And that was really impactful to me, that someone who was in the peak of her law career saw value in being in seminary. And that was when I felt this opening for myself to have permission to go to seminary and just pursue this thing and see where it was going and try to better understand what professional religious leadership could look like in my life. Of course, as you heard in my bio, I got halfway through that degree and dropped out, and I'm doing a master's in social work, and I have a very meandering call. But that moment was distinct for me, that I now understand my work more in the context of professional religious work. And I actually had started at Starr King Seminary before I joined OUUC. And I knew about Unitarian Universalism, but it was from going to a Unitarian Universalist seminary that I found my way to Unitarian Universalist worship and community.
Fun times. I want to add that, as illustrated by Rylee's story, it is kind of shifting, and I don't fully understand where it's at, but it is shifting, that the expectation is you have to have the Master of Divinity as opposed to a different degree, such as social work. So we'll see. I don't know if you can say more about that, but things are always changing. So so my story is that, and I shared some of this, I think, during when I preached in August, so it might be a little bit of a repeat, but I grew up Christian Reformed, which is a small, historically Dutch Protestant denomination, Calvinist denomination, and my dad was a pastor. And so I was very steeped in that. That was kind of my whole world. Even where we went to Christian school, but it was like more Baptist. And it was known to me that we don't believe those same things, right? So the theology, the doctrine was really, really strong. And I always loved to take notes during my dad's sermons and talk to him about it afterward. I definitely just had a proclivity for theology. And when I was in high school, I did service trips and leadership development trips and or camps. And then there was this one called Facing Your Future that my mom actually kind of worked for the organization that hosted this program. And it was specifically for youth, I think 11th and 12th grade, interested in attending seminary or going into ministry in this denomination, because it was at Calvin Seminary, which is in Grand Rapids, Michigan, named after the theologian John Calvin himself. So I went to that 3.5-week sort of summer camp for kids interested in ministry, because that's the kind of nerd I am. And I loved it, totally loved it. It was like a week and a half of seminary classes and a week or so of an experiential learning component. And mine was actually at a church plant in Calgary, Alberta. And so I went to college thinking I would probably major in psychology or something thereof. I ended up majoring in sociology, not too far off, and what was called reconciliation studies. But in the midst of my Christian liberal arts college experience, long story short, I was like, oh, I don't think I'm a Christian anymore. So I was like, well, I guess I'm not going to become a minister. It turns out one of the reasons I thought I couldn't be a Christian was that I wasn't sure Jesus was the Son of God, quote unquote. and I was just probably a Unitarian, but I didn't know what Unitarianism was. So I left the church, as they say, and that's how I viewed it at the time, right? Now I have a different relationship to that, but at the time I was like, I'm done with this. There was a lot of hurt and betrayal because of feeling like I had not been taught the truth around justice issues connected to Christianity, etc. So fast forward, I guess, to 2016, I was about to turn 30, and two things happened. One, I discovered the podcast Harry Potter and the Sacred Text, which is still my favorite podcast. Let me repeat the name, because everyone should listen to it. It's called Harry Potter and the Sacred Text. And basically, it's my ultimate nerddom of like Harry Potter and spirituality combined. And the two co-hosts were Harvard Divinity School graduates, one of whom identifies as a Jewish atheist, and one who identified at the time as a Christian atheist. And now he says he's a little less atheist. And I was like, wait a moment, like, people can go to divinity school and be an atheist? What is this? And so that really like turned on a switch in my brain. And then I loved when they talked about chaplaincy and their stories of like doing clinical pastoral education. I was just really drawn in by that. Then two, I got to go to Standing Rock, where the tribe, the Standing Rock Sioux, were resisting the pipeline construction just for 6 days. But it was really transformative for a lot of reasons, one of which was this idea that ceremony and prayer are the same as resistance, right? Like resistance is prayer / ceremony, ceremony / prayer is resistance. Sort of that indigenous way of like being in the world is resistance. And being spiritual can be resistance. So that was really compelling to me. And I realized that's kind of what I had been looking for a long time. And then I met this UU minister there who happened to be the minister of a church in Virginia. And I was about to move to Virginia from Minnesota in 1 week. So I started attending his church, and that was my awakening to the fact that you could be a minister and not have to be a Christian. And I'd been adjacent to UU worlds in my social justice work, but I had never gotten myself to go to church again until I moved and I was seeking community, right? Because I was in a new area. And then I went to church and I really felt a lot of healing. Specifically, it wasn't the same sort of negative or baggage-filled experience that it was when I went to a Christian church. So fast forward to about a year later, a lot of things happened in my life. And I'll just tell the quick story, which is that I was in a tiny house on a friend's land, sort of healing mind, body, soul, because a bunch of things had happened. And I was journaling one evening in the bunk, like the loft bed. And I remember the moment where I realized, oh, what I actually want to do next in my life, because I was searching that out, is go to divinity school. And it was just so clear to me. I had been trying to sort of fit into these other molds of like, maybe I should be a social worker, maybe I should be a teacher. But it hit me like, no, what I actually really want is to go to divinity school. And it was there that I kind of confirmed my call to actually continue becoming a UU minister. So that's my story.
Emi, I want to make space for you to share your call story if you would like.
I think
Sure.
this-
Yep. Can you hear me?
Yep, I'm seeing nods, Emi. They can hear you.
Okay. Okay. I've always been a spiritual person. I grew up, my earliest place of worship was a congregational church in Kirkland, Washington. And then after moving to Olympia, I attended OUUC with my mom. And well, I won't go through my whole spiritual journey, but I found I really loved UU spirituality and practice as a young person, and found that it fit well with my interest and involvement in social justice. When I turned 18, I went to college. I studied art and social justice. And then I went to massage school because I thought it was more a practical way of helping others. Then I realized that that was not, I finished, but I realized that's not what I wanted to do. I ended up moving into a Buddhist temple, and I was a Buddhist nun for 9 years. And that was a mixed experience, but I got to do spiritual leadership. I was the education program coordinator and did a lot of chaplaincy. As a 25-year-old, I helped people die a few times, and that was very impactful for me. I had never seen someone die, and I ended up leaving that path, and I finished my undergraduate at Evergreen, and I just still love Unitarian Universalism. But also just am continuing my spiritual journey. So Starr King is, I don't remember having like a specific, like, I'm going to go to Starr King, like out of nowhere. I talked to Reverend Mary about it, and just kind of kept coming to OUUC, and then eventually dipped my toes in. But I have to say that I don't know that I really belong on this forum. I'm not sure what I'm really doing in seminary. I guess I'm only in my second semester, so I feel that I'm kind of the clay blob that Reverend Mary mentioned. So I'm not exactly sure what I want to do, but yeah, hopefully that answers the question.
Thanks for being here, Emi. You absolutely belong here. Thank you. My call to ministry is one that I've heard from others as well. It was a process, and there was a moment of insight. I found Unitarian Universalism in 1989 when my husband and I moved to Eastern Washington in the Tri-Cities area. And we were kind of like, what have we done? And where are the progressives? And so it was seeking community. And what I found was a spiritual community that I didn't know I was missing. And like many who have a similar story to mine, I did lots of lay leadership, teaching classes and serving on the board and all those kinds of things that we do in my own spiritual formation, and was part of a variety of UU churches in different places for about 12 years. And then when we lived in Lansing, Michigan, I was sitting on our deck one day and writing in my journal, and a cardinal flew by, a bright red cardinal. And the cardinal brought the message of, oh, I want to be a minister. And so you'll see on my installation, on my ordination stole, there's a cardinal, and there are cardinals all over my office here at OUUC to help me remember my call. And for me, it was kind of like, what? I don't come from a ministry family. There's never been a minister in my family. And I was kind of like, I have no idea what this means. And it was conversations with other people and UU ministers that really helped me figure that out. It was another 12 years before I went to seminary. And because I already had a path, I was on a social work path and I liked it and had a career and was doing fine, right? And so promptly ignored that cardinal and the call. It really took getting to a place of burnout in a large state system, thinking that I could change the world and realizing that I really couldn't, and maybe needing some spiritual grounding for myself and helping others find that, similar to what Carol mentioned. That led me to seminary. I intentionally chose Starr King because it was challenging for me. It was an unstructured environment. You all know how much I like structure. And it was there was a radicalness to Starr King that I really appreciated and still appreciate about that. And I guess the other thing I'll say is that when I had my career assessment, the vocational testing, the psychologist said to me, because I was going to be a chaplain. I was a social work, had done counseling. Of course, I was going to be a chaplain. And the career assessment psychologist minister said, you would be a fine chaplain. And you don't like to be bored. So I think you belong in a parish. And I just want you all to know that I have never been bored here. Back to you, Sarah.
Thank you. Thank you all for speaking to your call. The next question I have is specifically for our student ministers. And so I'm going to start with you, Emi, and then move to Elisabeth and Rylee. But the question is, where are you in the formation process, and what has been rewarding and challenging for you about the process of ministerial formation? So over to you first, Emi, if you're okay with that. And you're still muted, Emi. There you are.
I don't really know where I am. I'm at 0, I guess. I talked to Reverend Mary, and Reverend Mary gave her blessing and wrote me a recommendation letter. So I'm in seminary. I haven't filled out any of the paperwork on any of the formation stuff. I don't even really understand it, to be honest. But my mentor, who's a UU minister in Arizona, Anthony Johnson, he says it doesn't matter right now. He's just telling me to like follow my heart. So I guess what I felt most rewarding is just being with others and like exploring issues of justice and spirituality. I'm really just kind of integrating my activism into my studies, and I'm just kind of okay with being in this like random zone right now. I'm just really in a exploratory mode. I'm not really in a hurry. So yes, I feel a lot of freedom, and I really enjoy the students at my school. Yeah.
Thank you, Emi. And that same question to you, Elisabeth and Rylee. What's been rewarding and challenging at the place that you are in the formation process?
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. So actually, basically, right after I felt this, distinct sense of call, I applied to school, and I got to an opportunity to work at the UU church where I was attending. And so I worked there as the youth, young adult, and social justice coordinator for about 10 months. And then I moved from Virginia to Nashville, Tennessee to start at Vanderbilt Divinity School. And so I graduated in August of 2021. And then I moved here for a chaplain residency program at St. Peter Hospital, Providence, St. Peter. And I just completed that in this August. And now I'm looking for full-time jobs as a healthcare chaplain. Where I'm at in the formation process is that I'm technically still an aspirant. I've completed the clinical pastoral education requirement to be a candidate, but not the career assessment. And I actually have that scheduled November 2nd. So I hope to be considered a candidate in November, which means then I will get to set my date with the MFC, hopefully for some time in 2023, at which point I would go before them to, pitch myself as a minister. So that's where I'm at in the process. I guess I'll add that I see myself in chaplaincy for the next, several years. Healthcare chaplaincy has a lot of rewards and challenges. One reward is that you can actually earn a decent living. And so that feels important to me right now, to have that stability. I used to be a community organizer and activist who did not prioritize finances. And I'm at a point where I'd like to prioritize financial stability. So, that's a reward, but the challenge is, of course, working in this healthcare system that absolutely sucks. So, but that too is nuanced in the sense that even the medical technology that we have in this country, is just amazing sometimes, and so literal life-giving, and then other times it's death-dealing, right? And so navigating so many social justice issues within that system. But really, the huge reward is just getting to be with people in some of their most vulnerable moments. And when people are dying, or just when people are very sick, or going into surgery, or having a baby, or whatever it might be. That sort of connection that you sometimes get to form with patients and just walk through hell with them and maybe back, but you're there with them. My friend often, who is also a chaplain, says it as like, they're going to go through hell either way, and I'd rather get to walk through it with them, So, that's just such a privilege and an honor. The other thing I will add is that Vanderbilt Divinity School was an amazing, amazing and challenging experience, in the sense that one reason I chose it was because they have these big universities have huge endowments. And so I came out with very little student debt. So I feel extremely privileged for that reason. And that was strategic, right? However, because it was not a UU affiliated school, it was very isolating and lonely sometimes in terms of my process. I often had to just figure out how to make it work for myself. And I had very little institutional support when it came to UU stuff. That said, I had support from my UU congregation in Nashville, and the minister who was about to retire, Reverend Gail Seavey, was a fantastic mentor. And so I was really grateful for that. And as far as Vanderbilt goes, the other thing I want to say is, the community there was hugely rewarding. There was a lot of, specifically, I was part of a public theology and racial justice collaborative. And I there were just many opportunities for learning and growing, and being pushed regarding especially racial justice issues, but social justice writ large as well. And I was constantly inspired by the work of my colleagues and my professors, and called to be sort of my best self by them. Vanderbilt has a strong core of LGBTQ and queer leadership, and so in the faculty, and so that was a really fantastic learning environment in that way. So
just to reinforce, Emi, what you were told by your mentor, I am currently a candidate, and I didn't really start filling out paperwork until I basically had everything to be a candidate. Because as an aspirant, I clicked some buttons online, and then I was an aspirant. As an applicant, I talked to a minister. I'd already done CPE before I came into UU, and so I had a lot of the necessary paperwork to move forward in the process fairly quickly. And being sponsored by OUUC was part of that paperwork process, which happened shortly after my joining and becoming a member. I am currently in this meandering process, which is that I don't want to finish my Master's of Divinity, and I'm going to enter into gluing my Master's of Social Work to the Master's of Divinity work that I have done, and creating a conglomerate degree that can be recognized, which I will probably have to take extra classes for anyways. And I do find a lot of frustration in dealing with the amount of hurdles that there are in UU ordination. And I don't know if you remember when Reverend Mary tried to briefly explain the ordination process, and it wasn't brief at all. It's onerous, and many of the steps feel unnecessary to me, and that it hasn't hindered my call to ministry, but it is part of my distractibility. And the Master's of Divinity that I was seeking was a 72-degree master's, a 90-degree master's at Starr King, and it's 30. Sorry, this is credits. That's what I was the word I was looking for. It was just a longer master's than a lot of basic master's programs. There was a lot of steps where I felt like, why is it this extra mile? And so that's been part of my own searching for identity with the level of expectation of UU ministers is sometimes extremely high, and it can feel invisible when the level of membership in a congregation is expressed as being extremely welcoming and inclusive, that then ministry can be this thing where it's like, well, did you read 50 books? I can't actually tell you how much my ministerial colleagues dread the MFC. Sitting before the judgment of your fellow ministers and letting them decide whether or not your call to ministry can be validated and blessed is extremely distressing. But it's been considered necessary, and it's part of the process. And so I'm in my own meandering way looking for the times where I feel ready to move forward. And I've been a candidate for several years now. And I actually didn't have to do an internship, but I chose to do a congregational internship in Arizona. It started September 2020, which was an awkward moment in ministry. But I did a 1-year-long internship with 4 congregations in Southeast Arizona, and it was a really wonderful experience. And it helped me to better understand what UU ministry can look like and what it means to be in this moment where ministry is changing and ministers are transforming how congregations function together and in the community. I had previously worked with No More Deaths, which is a Unitarian Universalist kind of organization that does border work. And so I had previously encountered those congregations, and that was part of my call to Southern Arizona, is that I knew some of the political climate and I knew some of the work that those congregations were doing. And I am really interested in congregations that are living their faith in their communities. I feel like I could I mean, I'm just like a meanderer in my journey to ministry, and so I could ramble on and on, but I also want to recognize that we're over the time that we expected to run. And so this is maybe the first of other conversations in this community about what it means to have student ministers here and what it looks like we're in formation very much so. And so the opportunity to preach here has been amazing. And this is just a really nourishing congregation. And I feel really lucky to be sponsored by this congregation. And I'm excited to be in conversation with y'all.
I want to add just a few things about the economics of ministry. It's going to seminary. Number one is just, even though you might have good financial benefits from your particular seminary or the college or university, it's very expensive. And coming out of seminary then becomes an additional challenge. For example, finding a ministry in which you can afford to live. And particularly, and that's why chaplaincy within a healthcare system like Providence or whatever at least assures a regular paycheck, or a called ministry full-time in a congregation. People who are in entrepreneurial or community ministry have to create their own income. In other words, find a path to income. So that's a real challenge in ministry. And we're not speaking just of Unitarian Universalist ministry, but ministry in general. So that's an additional challenge that each one of us has faced or is facing as you continue down the ministerial path. Yet the satisfaction in doing ministry is, I think, tremendous. I mean, it's just a wonderful way, if you have a call, a sense that you have a way to serve the world, your community, the world, your denomination. It's a wonderful way to live.
Yeah, thanks, Carol. I just want to add that I'm pretty passionate about the fact that we don't talk about class enough in society, and I think in UU churches. And that's part of why my bio is written the way it is. I'm proud to say that I'm from a working class background, although interestingly, I was raised to be middle class, which is a whole conversation around how class operates in America. But the point is that, you know, it was sort of under that fictitious idea, I would say, that like, oh, so many of us are middle class. Well, my father was a pastor and my mother was a teacher. So regardless of sort of how you see the politics of these things, income-wise, we were much more working class than we were middle class, but it was wealthy Northern Virginians, so you got to get in to fit in, right? And so, you know, I had no possibility of helping, like having my parents help me or anybody help me going to seminary. And so that was a consideration, right? How am I going to pay for this without going into enormous debt? And I think that it's just good to recognize that we have working class people in our congregations and in ministry, and that doesn't sort of get swept under the rug as if we're all sort of what we call middle class. And that's a whole nother sort of topic, I think, around too, like resources and wealth and all of that, that we'll save for another day. But I just wanted to note that because I think I'm part of actually a ministerial formation network small group that's people with working class backgrounds who are becoming ministers in the same small group. And it's been really fantastic to sort of have that caucus. And I feel like really honored to get to sort of be in process with those colleagues. So.
Sarah, I know you have a coming of age class waiting for you at 12:30. So I just want to thank you for moderating. Anything else you want to say before we close out here?
I would like to thank everyone for being here, and a big thank you to our student ministers. And since we ran out of time to get questions from you all in the congregation, please feel free to email your questions. I'm sure this is not the last time that we will organize some education around the process of ministerial formation. So I'm happy to receive your questions, and I will pass them along to all of our panelists today as well. Thank you all. I do have to duck off, but thank you for being here.
Thank you, Sarah. And I had one other thing I just wanted to mention on the line of economics. One of the things that I'm interested in having conversation around in this congregation that is learning to be a teaching congregation is an intern minister. So I get contacted several times a year by people looking for internships and who would love to come here. And I won't take an intern until we can afford it. Although interns, offer to come and work here for no pay, it's a justice issue. And so you will hear conversation in the next stewardship drive about raising funds to support an intern minister in this congregation. It would be a wonderful internship. And I feel really strongly that the justice piece of the work that we do says that we should pay a reasonable and living wage for an intern here. So, yeah, so lots more conversation. Elisabeth, Rylee, Carol, Emi, thank you so much for being here in all the ways that you are. And thanks for your interest. Perhaps we can stick around a little bit if you have other questions. So thank you all.